Good morning. Now you get to hear from the accountant. I want to thank the Mercatus Center for stimulating a lot of research that has been very helpful to my budget committee and drew quite a bit of criticism from my ranking member to begin with. But that has mellowed, and he's found that some of the answers that we've been provided are actually pretty helpful. And I'm hoping that we are headed toward a bipartisan reform of the budget and that it will include regulatory reform. We've been working on that. And I highly recommend the papers that are out there on the desk that I assume you've been hearing about this morning. Very beneficial. I'll review them in more detail myself. Unfortunately for Wyoming, in the past month, the people in my state have felt firsthand the effects of the awful consequences of federal overregulation. It's forced 3 of Wyoming's largest coal producers to file bankruptcy in March. 2 of the biggest coal companies had to cut 15% of their workforce, so they laid off 456 workers all in the same week. Now, I know that the suffering of 456 people suddenly out of work doesn't sound bad in a place like maybe California or New York. But in Wyoming, that's larger than the population of a lot of our towns. In fact, we only have 19 towns where the population exceeds the elevation. We're the least populated state in the nation. Our biggest city is 58,000. And every town in Wyoming, you can go outside of the town, you can see the whole thing at one time. So 456 people is a really big deal. And in Wyoming, energy production is the cornerstone of the economy. In fact, it is the economy in the county that I'm from. The county that I'm from produces 40% of the nation's coal, which results in 40% of the nation's electrical power. We also have oil, natural gas, a thing called coal bed methane, which is a natural gas, and uranium. And when something happens in the energy field, it affects us. We've never had it happen to all of the energy fields all at the same time. In 2014, Wyoming's 20 mines directly employed 6,500 workers, and they earned an average salary of $84,000, which is almost twice our state average. The industry indirectly employs tens of thousands more contractors and jobs that support the coal industry. And the coal industry paid over $1.14 billion in Wyoming taxes, royalties, and other revenue in 2014. Now that doesn't count what we really count on, which is the coal bonus bids. If a company gets a bid for additional coal, they have to pay a substantial fee. That has built most of the schools in Wyoming in the last 10 years. In fact, every town has a new school. It's one-time money, so the legislature said, we don't want to spend that on continuing things. We'll spend it on one-time purchases. We have a very responsible conservative state legislature. So, with all that money and those good jobs, how did Wyoming find itself to be the fastest growing unemployment rate in the nation? Well, part of it's a lack of understanding, I think, of the president, because I noticed that both the president and Hillary Clinton said, if you're not a coal miner, this won't affect you. Yeah, tell that to the 1,000, actually it was 1,300 railroad employees that got laid off because they don't have that coal to haul. And it's affected, of course, the shops, the restaurants. One of the shops had 60% decline in the sales that they were making. And I noticed that most of them are blue-collar beer drinkers because the big specials in Gillette, Wyoming right now are reductions in the price of beer. Got to get those people into the restaurant somehow. So it was the very thing that you've been talking about, the burdensome federal regulations. For the coal industry, it really started in 2012 with the Environmental Protection Agency issuing its final mercury air toxic standard rule. Sounds like a really critical thing. It got worse in 2015 when the Department of Interior Steam Protection Rule and then the EPA's Clean Power Plan. Now, actually, the Supreme Court struck down that mercury and air toxic standard rule, and they did it because it had a very incomplete cost-benefit analysis. The cost is determined to be, well, I'll start with the benefits. The benefits are going to be $500,000 to $6 million a year. The cost is $10 billion a year. There's a lot of innovation you can do for $9.5 billion a year, and that was never an option. The Clean Power Plan is still making its way through the courts, but the damage has been done. The companies start complying when the rule passes, and the administration knows that you can't put toothpaste back in the tube. The impact of these bad administrative regulations is tangible. The people in Wyoming are depressed, and they're angry. On the other corner of the state, I have a little town called Kemmerer, and they have a coal mine and a power plant, and the sole customer for the coal mine is the power plant. And the EPA came in and said 1/3 of that power plant has to be converted to natural gas. And they said, well, you know, what you're telling us to do with natural gas, we can do with the coal. We need about 5 years more depreciation time to make it cost benefit and still keep the rates down. I said, no, you can't have that. So that puts 1/3 of the people in the town out of work, the 1/3 that are coal miners, and the 1/3 that run that one part of the power plant. Because the final decision by them was, we're just not going to turn that 1/3 of the power plant on anymore. So I'm telling you about the situation in my home state because I want you to know that these are people who are depending on regulatory reform for their jobs and their livelihoods. The tremendous work ahead to get regulatory reform done isn't going to be measured by just higher economic output or holding down the number of pages in the Federal Register. It's going to be measured by the communities where the small businesses can grow, by the industries that can innovate and meet the nation's economic demands, and by workers who know that their work is building value, and by families who can make their own choices about how to meet their daily needs. One of the first things that we know about over-regulation is that it's expensive, both in terms of lost national production and smaller individual pocketbooks. I know that the first panel of this morning's program focused on the economic costs of regulation and the opportunities that reform presents. I commend the Mercatus Center for working to document the many different ways that regulation holds back the economy and making the case for real reform to people who don't realize or don't admit the harm of overregulation. The cumulative cost of regulations paper released yesterday that was discussed by some of its authors here this morning says that economic growth has been slowed by 0.8% per year since 1980 due to the cumulative effects of regulation. Or, to state it another way, in 2011, the economy was $4 trillion smaller than it had been in the absence of regulatory burden since 1980. 4 trillion, that doesn't sound like much, that's just 4. I try to translate that all into at least billions. That would be 4,000 billions. And I'll say a little more on that in a bit. As an accountant and chairman of the Budget Committee, one of my missions is to help people understand the tremendous astronomical size of the amounts we deal with in revenue and spending. The question that this important study attempts to answer is, what's the true cost of regulations? The true cost of regulations is bigger than people realize. Most people have a good idea of what a million is. A billion, of course, is 1,000 million. That's a bit harder to get your head around, and then a trillion's 1,000 billion. So, 1,000 million? I don't know, I'm still having trouble with a million, but the regulatory burden since 1988 has come to $4,000 billion. And if you think the size of regulatory cost is overwhelming, that's nothing to how complex, time-consuming, confusing, and contradictory the regulatory requirements can be for people who have to live with them, especially for small business. My wife and I had a shoe store, and OSHA started just at the same time we started our shoe store. And originally, it had it so that if you stored anything above head level you had to wear a hard hat. Well, a shoe falling on you from that far isn't going to hurt you. But that was the regulation. You could be fined if you didn't have it. So I've spoken to businesses in Wyoming that have stopped measuring their regulatory work in pages because it's easier to measure them in feet. The time it takes to comply with regulations isn't hours. In most cases, it isn't even days, but weeks. Entrepreneurs don't build a business because they want to become experts in paperwork and compliance. And sometimes these things are pretty irrelevant rules, too. I'm on the education committee, so I've dealt with the free and reduced lunches and noticed that in Wyoming, some of the small communities were stopping free and reduced lunches. So I got a hold of them to find out what the problem was. And they said, well, we were about to have to put on one more person just to handle the paper reporting in order to get the little bit of funds that we get. And we decided that we could give everybody pizza every day if we didn't have the free and reduced lunches. And I said, well, so what, any other effects? They said, oh, yes. Now that we're feeding the kids what they want, we've gone from 6 garbage cans to 1 garbage can. Pretty visual. I talked to some of my small bankers, and they were talking about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Incidentally, if there's a significant small business impact, there's supposed to be a special committee to review those regulations. The problem? There's no definition for what significant impact is. Secondly, the decision is made by the agency that's putting out the rule. So you can see that not many of those ever happen. But I talked to these small businessmen and I said, how's this affecting you? And they talked about the new employees they were having to put on, and they showed me charts that they had to have so that they could check off all the boxes to make sure they weren't going to be fined for processing a loan improperly. And I said, you know, we own a house in D.C., we call it the cabin, and a house in Wyoming, and both of them are paid for. And in Wyoming, my wife would like to expand the kitchen a little bit. So if I wanted to get a loan for that, how long would it take? Now, I know how long it used to take. How long would it take now? And they said 89 days in order to comply with all of the regulations and all the paperwork that I'd have to file, and they'd have to file, and I'd have to review and sign that I had reviewed. 89 days. But that's not all. I'd have to wait 7 days after the approval to see if I wanted to reject the loan or not. That's not all. After the loan's made, up to 150 days, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has the right to say that I shouldn't have made that loan, that I shouldn't have accepted that loan, they shouldn't have made the loan. So I guess technically you have to wait another 150 days to see if you get the money or not. Didn't happen in the old days. And the old days weren't very long ago. If you had a business in a community and were doing well and had your house paid for, you could get loans pretty fast. But people go into business because they have a product they believe in or an idea they're passionate about, and every hour that goes by filling out forms and meeting bureaucratic requirements is a loss. It's a cost to the spirit of innovation that got them started. When we look at reforming rulemaking and regulation, we need to keep in mind the innovative spirit that drives people at every level of the economy. Too often, regulation doesn't solve the problem that regulators are trying to get at. Or worse, regulations are solutions looking for a problem. But we don't check that. If regulations are necessary, they need to target real, tangible problems. Should be problems that can actually be evaluated and valued. Regulators need to state specifically what they're trying to solve, including how to measure it if the solution is working. If regulators actually had that information, they could share it with industries, businesses, entrepreneurs, and communities. If we gave the information to an industry or community and asked for their ideas, I have no doubt that innovation would win out with creative solutions that don't come with the burden of most rules entail today. I really believe in innovation, and I think that that's been stifled and actually eliminated. This area of coal is one of those that I've noticed that they don't believe that it could ever be made better or cleaner, that it needs to just stay in the ground. Well, General Electric didn't believe that, and they started to build a facility to do coal improvement, which they canceled. They said, with this administration, there's not going to be any customers. You can't do something if there's not going to be a customer. Now, at the University of Wyoming, I ran into some young innovators, and they figured out how to grow things in tubes. They look kind of like a eaves drain trough, but they run them up a wall, and then they put something in it so that you can grow things out this way. And so you could have a green wall at your house, growing all the vegetables that you could eat. And I asked them how many of those tubes they could put in a greenhouse. And they said, oh, it won't work in a greenhouse. They need too much CO2. They'd suffocate. I said, have you considered putting one of these next to a coal-fired power plant and using the residual heat and the CO2? They're looking into that now. So another person figured out how to use solar to take the hydrogen out of water to burn with coal to make it cleaner. So there are a lot of ideas. They just need a little bit of incentive and not have the regulations get in the way. But until we get away from a top-down, one-size-fits-all approach to regulation, where the people that are doing the regulation aren't even in the business that they're regulating. Till we get away from that, we're going to continue to miss out on tremendous gains that innovation could make for our economy and our communities. One of Congress's most important duties is oversight. Right now, in the face of an army of regulators, Congress has limited options for reining in agencies when they go too far or when they try to apply a law that's a way that it was never intended. Regulatory reform will create a better process for rulemaking, a process that will limit the burden on industry, communities, and families. That's jobs. But any system is at risk of being abused by overeager bureaucrats with an agenda who have never been in that business and don't know how that business works. I do a Wyoming Works tour most weekends. I'm in Wyoming most weekends, and I travel a different part of the state all the time. And I try to get into a business or two to see how they work. Because even though I was in business, I have found out that any business that I wasn't in looks pretty simple. And there are a lot of people that haven't even been in business, so it looks even simpler, I think. Of course, a lot of people think that Congress looks pretty simple. But I've found out that there's a lot of work to finding employees, finding ones with the right skills, knowing what to pay them, figuring out their own product, how far in advance to make it, how to sell it, how to collect on it, and those are all major decisions for them. And then they have to meet the federal regulations. Right now, our options are limited to tools like the Congressional Review Act, which is subject to a presidential veto. I think that's one of the mistakes we made when that law was passed. On any rule that Congress says should be written, Congress ought to be the final decider on whether that was the proper rule or not. Now, the president makes rules and regulations too, but sometimes lacks authority to do that. But at any rate, the Congressional Review Act requires the president's signature, and consequently, it's only been used once. It was used at the end of the Clinton administration when he decided to push through ergonomics in a hurry. And I was able to pass the Congressional Review Act in both the House and the Senate just as we changed presidents. And President Bush was willing to sign it. So we've used it once. Now, May 17th is kind of the drop-dead date on regulations. Anything that happens after that, we have that same possibility of using the Congressional Review Act again. I'm pretty sure with the dearth of regulations that are coming up that the president's well aware of that. Now, as Congress looks to enact a better system for rulemaking, I hope it will also create a better oversight tool. Our government's built on a system of checks and balances, and we've seen the consequences of letting the regulatory state go unchecked and how that can throw our economy off balance. There is currently no incentive or need, apparently, to review what's been done in the past. Goals weren't stated, so there's really no measurement for achieving. This is an issue my colleagues and I are working on. Since last year, the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee has made regulatory reform a priority, including a subcommittee dedicated to regulatory affairs. And as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, I'm working to underline the role that America's mounting burden of regulation plays in slowing the economic growth and thus adding to our overspending and debt nightmare. You notice I didn't call it deficit and debt. People get confused with that. They think they're pretty much the same. Deficit is our overspending. It can be done two ways, spending and not taxing enough maybe. But at any rate, it's overspending, not deficit. I'm also working on possible solutions such as a regulatory budget and other ideas that can hold back the accumulation of regulations and hopefully reduce the backlog of outdated and unnecessary regulations. I want to thank the Mercatus Center for its efforts to highlight the cost of overregulation and advance common sense regulatory reform. Their work's contributing to real changes in what regulation means for our country. I want to thank all of you who came to hear about this important issue. We can't succeed unless you take what you've learned today and build on it. What we're talking about here today isn't theoretical. At the end of the regulatory process are real businesses, real jobs, real communities, real people, real families. The choices we make today about how to define the rulemaking process and the regulatory system are choices about whether business will succeed, whether innovators will be able to turn an idea into a reality, and whether workers and their families will have economic security. It's a critical choice we're facing. It's a critical time for our economy. But I know our spirit of innovation is one of our best assets, and if we follow it, we can succeed. Thank you. Good to see you again. Good to see you.